Think about the first day of any job you have ever started. The uncertainty of where things are. The quiet anxiety of not yet knowing the unwritten rules. The gap between what you were trained to do and what actually happens when you are standing in the middle of it for the first time. Every job has a version of that gap. The space between the classroom and the reality. Between the training manual and the moment. Between the confidence of passing the test and the humility of the first time you realize the test was the easy part. Now imagine that gap, that ordinary, universal, first job uncertainty, and place it inside a context where the cost of miscalculation is not a reprimand or a lost client or an embarrassing mistake that you learn from and move on. Place it in a context where the cost is your life. That is the world that every newly badged police officer enters on their first shift. They have trained for months. They have passed written exams and physical tests and scenario exercises. They have been certified, sworn in, told they are ready, and then they walk out of the academy and into a world where hardened, experienced, violent criminals do not adjust their behavior because the officer in front of them is new. The criminals don't wait for you to find your footing. They don't soften the scenario. They don't present themselves in the ordered, manageable way that training environments can create. They present themselves as they are, often armed, often desperate, often with criminal histories that stretch back further than some rookies have been alive. And they do it on ordinary days, during ordinary calls, in circumstances that nothing in the training fully prepared the officer for. This episode is about what happens in that gap, not as a policy discussion, as a human story. The story of a 26-year-old man on his fourth patrol shift who drove up to a bank where a gunman was waiting in ambush and who ran toward the stage despite being shot at, despite his training officer going down beside him, despite having no way to know where the next bullet was coming from. The story of 4 officers who approach a house on a Monday afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, to serve a warrant on a convicted felon, and who never came home. The story of what law enforcement training is designed to give rookie officers, and what no training can fully provide. And the story of what it actually costs, in human terms, to be the person who answers a call when the call is the most dangerous thing that has happened in that city in years. This is what happens when rookie cops face hardened criminals. Story 1. 11 days out of the ACADMY Officer Nickolas Wilt, Old National Bank, Louisville, Kentucky, April 10, 2023. Officer Nickolas Wilt graduated from the Louisville Metro Police Department Academy on March 31, 2023. He was 26 years old. He had spent 7 years before his police career as a volunteer firefighter with the LaGrange Fire Department, and had also worked as a dispatcher for Oldham County EMS. Public service was, by every account from people who knew him, the defining thread of his adult life. He had wanted to do this work. He had prepared for it. And on April 10th, his 4th day of actual patrol shifts in the field, 11 days after he received his badge, he drove to East Main Street in downtown Louisville. The reason for the drive was a radio dispatch. A shooting at Old National Bank. Active. Officers responded within 3 minutes of the dispatch call. In the front seat of the patrol car, Nickolas Wilt was driving. In the passenger seat was Officer Corey C.J. Galloway, a 5U LMPD veteran who had been with the department since 2018 and who was, that morning, serving as Wilt's training officer. Galloway had been a training officer long enough to know what rookies struggled with, what they got right, and what the difference was between an officer who had the instincts for this job and one who would need time to develop them. He had spent 4 shifts with Nickolas Wilt. He already knew which category Wilt was in. The ambush, the shooting at Old National Bank on the morning of April 10, 2023, was not a robbery. It was not a spontaneous act of violence by someone whose situation had suddenly reached a breaking point in public. It was a premeditated, calculated act by a 25-year-old bank employee named Connor Sturgeon, who had purchased an AR-15 style rifle legally at a gun dealership days before the attack, and who had come to work that morning with a plan. The plan included what comes after the shooting starts. Sturgeon had positioned himself inside the bank's lobby, behind 2 sets of glass doors, at an elevated position several steps above street level. The position gave him a view of the approach path that arriving officers would use. It gave him a field of fire that covered the stairs they would climb. And because the glass of the doors was reflective from the outside but transparent from inside, he could see out, and responding officers could not see in. 5 people were killed in the bank before the first police vehicles arrived. The 5 victims, Joshua Barrick, Deanna Eckert, Tommy Elliott, Juliana Farmer, and James Tutt, ranged in, aged from 40 to 64. All of them were colleagues of the man who shot them. Tommy Elliott, 63, was a close personal friend of Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, who would later stand at a press conference visibly shaken, describing a man who had helped him build his law career and become governor, a man he had talked to constantly, a man he was now unable to call. The shooting had been live-streamed by Sturgeon on Instagram. He was still alive and positioned in the lobby when Wilt and Galloway arrived. The body cam footage released by the LMPD the following day, footage that was watched by millions of people across the country and was described by CNN's chief national affairs analyst as providing a raw, frightening scene laced with courage and heroism, shows exactly what happened in the 60 seconds that followed the patrol car's arrival at the bank. Wilt pulls up in the vehicle. The moment they stop near the entrance, Sturgeon opens fire from inside. Galloway shouts at Wilt to reverse. Wilt slams the car into reverse and backs away from the line of fire. They park further back. Both officers exit the vehicle. Galloway goes to the trunk and retrieves his service rifle. And then, and this is a moment that will stay with everyone who watched that footage, both of them advance. Up the stairs. Toward the lobby. Toward the position of a man with an AR-15 who had already killed 5 people and who was waiting at an elevated angle behind glass that hid him from them. Wilt is 11 days out of the academy. He has been on patrol for 4 shifts. He has had 4 days to learn the reality of the job from inside it rather than from a classroom. He does not hesitate. The moment on the stairs. LMPD Deputy Chief Paul Humphrey, at the press conference where the footage was released, described what happened next with the precision of someone who has reviewed the body cam frame by frame. He was going based on 2 things, Humphrey said of Wilt, his training and his character. At the top of the stairs, Sturgeon fires again. Both officers are hit. Galloway, grazed in the shoulder, tumbles back down the concrete steps and takes cover behind a planter box. He is wounded but functional. He gets back into position. He keeps communicating. He starts calling out to arriving backup. The shooter's position, the glass obstacle blocking the view, the need to retrieve Wilt. Wilt is shot in the head. He goes down. Deputy Chief Humphrey described something additional in Wilt's bodycam footage that became one of the most repeated facts from this case. Even after being shot, Wilt, a man who had been on patrol for 4 shifts, went back into the line of fire. The body cam captured a blurred figure moving in the immediate aftermath of being struck. Humphrey addressed it directly. He never hesitates, even after getting shot at. This young man went back into the line of fire in order to protect others, and you're going to see that in how he made his decisions and how they ultimately protected other people's lives. Galloway, taking cover and wounded, worked through the tactical problem with everything he had. As backup officers arrived on scene, he communicated the situation. The shooter's position, the glass, the elevation advantage, the officer down, the arrival of additional officers changed the geometry of the engagement. Sturgeon broke glass and continued to fire. Galloway maneuvered. He found an angle through the broken windows. "I think I got him down," Galloway is heard saying on the bodycam audio. "I think is down." At 8:47 in the morning, 7 minutes after the initial dispatch call, Connor Sturgeon was confirmed dead. The active threat was over. The rescue of Officer Wilt, while the threat was still being neutralized, was itself an act of courage captured on bodycam. Officers attempting to reach him came under fire from Sturgeon as they advanced. As they go up the stairs and attempt to rescue Officer Wilt, the suspect fires at them, trying to kill them in their process of trying to save Officer Wilt. Deputy Chief Humphrey told reporters. They got to him. The recovery. Officer Nickolas Wilt underwent brain surgery at a Louisville hospital within hours of being shot. He was placed on a ventilator. He spent approximately 1 month on life-sustaining equipment. His family was told to hope. On May 9th, 4 weeks after the shooting, the LMPD announced that Wilt had been taken off the ventilator. He was showing neurological improvement. He was able to follow some commands. He had infections, including pneumonia, that complicated his recovery but were described as improving. On July 28, 2023, 3.5 months after he was shot, Nickolas Wilt left the Fraser Rehabilitation Institute in Louisville. He was rolled out in a wheelchair by his twin brother Zach, flashing a thumbs up to a crowd of supporters including Jim Ryan, the CEO of Old National Bank, who was present to mark the moment. Nick gets to go home today, sleep in his own bed, with his own TV, Zach Wilt told reporters, and has been asking for a steak dinner for a couple weeks now. And you bet we're going to get him a steak dinner tonight. On January 30th, 2025, nearly 2 years after the shooting, Officer Nickolas Wilt was medically retired from the Louisville Metro Police Department at a ceremony at the Summit Wellness Center. He had served, in uniform, for 11 days. His retirement was attended by his colleagues, his family, and representatives of the department that had described him, from the moment his body cam footage was released to the public, as a hero without reservation. The 5 people killed inside Old National Bank that morning, Joshua Barrick, Deanna Eckert, Tommy Elliott, Juliana Farmer, and James Tutt, deserved to go to work on a Monday morning and come home that evening. They did not get that. Nickolas Wilt deserved to have more than 4 days in the field before the world asked everything of him. He got 11 days, 4 shifts, and a moment on a staircase that his training officer, Corey Galloway, later described in terms that said everything about what that young man was made of. He had no experience, Deputy Chief Humphrey said. He was going based on 2 things, his training and his character. 4 shifts, both things held. Here is a question I want you to put in the comments right now. Officer Wilt was on his 4th day of field patrol, his 4th shift, when he ran up those days. Connor Sturgeon had illegally purchased AR-15. He had set a deliberate ambush. The footage shows 2 officers approaching a position that gave the shooter every tactical advantage. What does this case, specifically the reality of what rookie officers are asked to walk into, tell us about the gap between academy training and field reality? And what do you think the public understands, or doesn't understand, about what that gap costs? Tell me below. Story 2. The warrant that ended INGUNVI officers I, Weeks, Poloche, and Elliott Charlotte, North Carolina, April 29, 2024. In East Charlotte, North Carolina, on the afternoon of April 29, 2024, a U.S. Marshal Fugitive Task Force was executing an arrest warrant. The address was 5000 block of Galway Drive, a residential street in a quiet suburban neighborhood where, according to neighbors who would later speak to reporters, life had been ordinary enough that nobody had any particular reason to think about what might happen there on a Monday afternoon. The man named in the warrant was 39-year-old Terry Clark Hughes, Jr. His criminal history in North Carolina included multiple charges. At the time of the April 29th warrant, he was wanted for possession of a firearm as a convicted felon, a felony in itself, and 2 counts of felony fleeing to elude arrest out of Lincoln County. He was a man with a documented willingness to run from law enforcement, a man prohibited by federal law from possessing a firearm, and a man who, as investigators were about to discover, had significantly more firepower at his disposal than anyone approaching that house was prepared for. The task force team that approached the residence on Galway Drive included officers from multiple agencies. Among them, Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas M. Weeks, Jr., 48 years old, of Louisville, North Carolina, a 13-year veteran of the Marshal Service who had spent a decade assigned to the Western District of North Carolina. Samuel Sam Poloche, a 14-year veteran of the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction, assigned to the task force, who left behind a wife and 2 children. William Alden Elliott, also a 14-year NCDAC veteran and task force member, who left behind a wife and 1 child. And Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department Officer Joshua I., 31 years old, 6 years CMPD veteran, Sergeant First Class in the North Carolina Army National Guard, member of the 178 recruit class. That same month, Officer I had been named one of CMPD's Employees of the Month for April. He left behind a wife named Ashley and a 3-year-old son named Andrew. What happened on Galway Drive? At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon on April 29th, the task force approached the residence to execute the warrant. The approach to serve a warrant on a felon wanted for gun possession follows established protocols, the kind of approach that task force officers conduct regularly, that requires preparation and coordination, and the kind of experience that multiple decades of combined law enforcement service provides. Terry Clark Hughes, Jr. opened fire before they could complete the approach. What followed in the next several minutes was among the deadliest single encounters between law enforcement and a suspect in recent American history. Hughes fired an AR-15 style rifle. He also had a .40 caliber handgun. When the scene was finally secured and investigators searched the property, they recovered more than 100 rounds of ammunition for both weapons, a stockpile that indicated Hughes had prepared, if not specifically for this encounter, then for significant armed resistance to any encounter. In the exchange of gunfire that followed his opening shots, 4 officers were killed, 4 more were wounded. Among the wounded were CMPD officers Chris Tolley, Mike Giglio, and Jack Blowers, all of whom were hospitalized with gunshot wounds but survived. A 4th officer, Justin Campbell, was treated for a broken foot. Thomas Weeks died in the line of duty at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. Sam Poloche and Alden Elliott were killed in the same engagement. Joshua I was critically wounded and transported to a hospital, where he died later that evening. CMPD Chief Johnny Jennings stood at a press conference that night and delivered news that his department had not had to deliver in 17 years, since the March 2007 deaths of officers Jeffrey Shelton and Sean Clark. Today is an absolute tragic day for the city of Charlotte and for the profession of law enforcement, he said. The men who were lost. Thomas Weeks Jr. was 48 years old. He had 13 years with the Marshal Service and a decade assigned to the same district where he died. He had a wife and 4 children in Moseville. The Marshal Service Director, Ronald Coleman, named him publicly and stated simply, he died doing the job he chose and was committed to protecting our community from dangerous criminals. Sam Poloche and Alden Elliott had each given 14 years to the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction before being assigned to the Fugitive Task Force. They had built careers, raised families, and spent those 14 years learning to work from the inside. Poloche's wife and 2 children, Elliott's wife and child. These are the people who received the call on April 29th. Joshua I had joined CMPD in 2017, the same year he married Ashley. He had spent 12 years in the North Carolina Army National Guard before his police career and had deployed twice in that service. He came home from those deployments. He came home from 6 years of patrol in Charlotte's North Tryon Division. He was named Employee of the Month in April 2024. At his funeral at First Baptist Church in Charlotte on May 3rd, his son Andrew, 3 years old, waved at his father's casket as it passed. His mother Ashley, beside him, was photographed kissing the boy's forehead in the moment captured at the church. Hundreds of uniformed CMPD officers lined the streets. A horse-drawn caisson carried I from department headquarters to the church. The procession was Charlotte's answer to what had happened on Galway Drive. Not just from the department, from the city. The felon at the center, Terry Clark Hughes Jr., was killed by officers during the standoff. He died in the front yard of the house where he had been waiting. The investigation that followed revealed a criminal history extensive enough that investigators from multiple agencies acknowledged publicly that the threat he represented, a man prohibited from possessing firearms, known to have fled from law enforcement previously, living in a house with an AR-15, a handgun, and more than 100 rounds of ammunition, was exactly the kind of threat that fugitive task forces exist to address. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Chief Jennings noted 2 persons of interest, a woman and a 17-year-old, who were inside the house and subsequently brought to the station for questioning. Both eventually exited following SWAT negotiations. The question of how a convicted felon prohibited by federal law from possessing a firearm came to have an AR-15, a .40 caliber handgun, and over 100 rounds of ammunition in a residential property was one that investigators were actively pursuing in the aftermath of the shooting. It is the same question that sits at the center of too many of these cases. A man the law says cannot have a gun, or in this case, multiple guns, in his possession regardless. And 4 officers who walked up to a house on a Monday afternoon to execute a warrant and never walked back. Here is a question I want your honest answer to. Terry Clark Hughes Jr. was convicted felon, prohibited under federal law from possessing any firearm. He had an AR-15, a .40 caliber handgun, and more than 100 rounds of ammunition. 4 officers are dead. Do you think the legal and law enforcement framework currently in place to prevent convicted felons from accessing firearms is working? And if not, what specifically would need to change? Tell me in the comments. Story 3. What training gives you, and what IT doesn't see the gap between the academy and the street? Officer Nickolas Wilt graduated from his academy on March 31st, 2023. By April 10th, he had been on 4 field patrol shifts. He had sat through hundreds of hours of classroom instruction, scenario training, physical preparation, and certification testing. He had been assessed, evaluated, and cleared as ready to serve. And then he drove to Old National Bank. The Carolinas Regional Fugitive Task Force officers who approached 5,000 Galway Drive on April 29, 2024, included men with 13 and 14 years of experience apiece. They had served warrants before. They had approached dangerous men before. They had done this exact kind of work, building the net around violent criminals, serving the warrants that put them back behind bars, for over a decade each. And Terry Clark Hughes Jr. opened fire before they could get to the door. The question of what law enforcement training prepares officers for, and what it cannot, is not a question with a clean answer, but it is one that every officer who has been through an academy and then survived their first years in the field will give you a version of if you ask them. The training gives you procedure. It gives you muscle memory for specific scenarios. It gives you the legal framework, the communication protocols, the tactical vocabulary, the chain of command. It gives you the practice representatives for the situations that are common enough to be reliably reproduced in a training environment. What training cannot give you is what Nickolas Wilt needed at the top of those days, and what, according to Deputy Chief Humphrey and the officers who reviewed his body cam footage, he had anyway, not because of training, because of character. The Pocatello example, Day 3. In May 2022, the same year that the U.S. Department of Justice published its Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service in Policing, a case was documented from the Pocatello Police Department in Idaho that illustrates this dynamic from a different angle. Officers Demetrius Amos and Mackenzie Handel, both experienced officers, responded to a domestic disturbance call in which a man was threatening a woman and a child with a gun. With them were trainees, new hires on just their third day with the department. 3 days, not 11. 3. The situation required immediate, decisive action in the kind of environment that compresses a gap between trained for this and doing this into a matter of seconds. The experienced officers led, managed the scene, and protected everyone involved, including the trainees who were experiencing their third day of field work. The subject was disarmed. Nobody was killed. Officers Amos and Handel received the AG's Distinguished Service Award for their conduct. The trainees, presumably, went home and processed what their third day of work had looked like. This is not an unusual story in the landscape of American law enforcement. What is unusual is when it becomes news, when the gap between training and reality produces something dramatic enough to reach public consciousness. Most of the time, the gap is navigated quietly. An experienced training officer manages the situation. The rookie follows a protocol they were trained on and doesn't freeze. The scene resolves without a permanent record. The cases that reach this episode are the cases where the gap was impossibly wide, where even experience couldn't bridge it, where a hardened criminal with a staged ambush or an AR-15 stockpile met a group of officers, some new, some veterans, in a moment that training couldn't fully prepare any of them for. What the Academy does, specifically, the Modern Law Enforcement Academy in the United States runs between 16 and 24 weeks on average, depending on state standards and department requirements. The content covers use of force law, firearms qualification, vehicle operation, first aid and medical response, community engagement, report writing, scenario-based active threat response, and the psychological and ethical foundations of sworn law enforcement. Some academies now include de-escalation training specifically developed after research into what produces unnecessary force encounters. Some include implicit bias instruction. Some include simulation technology that creates high-fidelity representations of the decision-making pressure that a real encounter creates. None of it is a real thing. There is a physiological reason for this that the force science research community has been documenting for decades. In a genuine high-stakes encounter, a real confrontation, not a simulation, the human body activates a cascade of stress responses that change sensory processing, fine motor function, cognitive performance, and time perception in ways that no training environment fully replicates. Heart rate spikes above 170 beats per minute, a threshold at which complex motor skills degrade, and visual tunnel narrowing reduces peripheral awareness. Auditory exclusion can make gunshots seem distant or absent. Time distortion compresses or stretches seconds in ways that are impossible to predict or prepare for individually. The scenarios that happen at the top of those banks days or on the approach to a house on Galway Drive are happening in bodies that are experiencing all of that simultaneously, in real time, with no ability to pause and review the training module. What experienced officers have that rookies don't is not the absence of that response. It is accumulated exposure to it. The body learns, over repeated encounters, to continue functioning within the stress response. Not to eliminate it, nobody eliminates it, but to operate through it, to execute trained behavior even while the physiological storm is happening. Nickolas Wilt had 4 shifts of accumulated exposure when he got out of that patrol car on East Main Street. He ran up the stairs anyway. The training officer dynamic. The relationship between a training officer and a rookie is one of the most important and least publicly discussed dynamics in law enforcement. The training officer is not a supervisor in the conventional sense. They are something closer to the person whose judgment and behavior a rookie officer will absorb and replicate in the critical period when professional identity is being formed. A good training officer teaches procedure and also teaches judgment, the things that don't fit in a policy manual, when to push and when to wait, how to read a scene before it escalates, what the body language of someone about to do something dangerous looks like, the specific vocabulary that de-escalates rather than inflames, the difference between protocol following and actual situation management. C.J. Galloway had been Wilt's training officer for 4 shifts. In those 4 shifts, and in the 9 minutes of bodycam footage released after the shooting, the dynamic between them is visible in its essentials. Galloway making tactical decisions, Wilt executing them. Galloway down on the stairs, wounded, calling out positions and needs. Wilt blurred in the footage, struck somewhere on the same stairs. When the scene was secured and Wilt was rescued, Galloway had already done what training officers do. He had stayed in the fight after being hit, had communicated what his wounded assessment of the situation was, and had ultimately found the angle that ended the threat. That is not the behavior of a man who was defeated by what happened. That is a behavior of someone who understood, down to his foundation, that the job does not stop when you get hurt. What Galloway could not do was protect Wilt from what Wilt had already chosen to do. He had told him to reverse. Wilt had reversed. Then they had both gotten out of the car and gone up the stairs. Together. Because that is what the training said to do, and because that is what the character of both men produced when the training and the reality converged. Here is a question I want you to think about before we go to the final story. C.J. Galloway, the training officer, was with Wilt on his 4th shift. He had been a training officer long enough to know what good officers were made of. In the aftermath of the shooting, Galloway was described as continuing to perform under fire after being wounded, ultimately killing the shooter. Do you think the training officer role in law enforcement gets adequate recognition? And do you think the public understands how much the quality of that relationship shapes what a new officer becomes? Tell me below. Story 4. What the badge costs, and what we owe the people who wear it. This final story is not about a specific arrest or specific incident. It is about the full arc of what we have seen in this episode, and what it demands that we reckon with honestly. We have watched a 26-year-old on his 4th patrol shift run up a staircase toward a prepared ambush. We have watched 4 officers walk up a driveway to serve a routine warrant and not come home. We have considered what training gives and what it cannot give, and what the gap costs when it is exposed in the worst possible way. Before we close, this story needs to be told directly, about what the badge actually costs. Not the idea of the badge, the reality of it, the numbers behind the stories. According to the FBI's law enforcement officers killed and assaulted data, the years 2021 through 2023 produced the highest 3-year total of felonious officer deaths in 2 decades, 63 in 2021, 61 in 2022, and 60 in 2023. The 2021 total of 63 was the highest single-year count since 1995. Within those totals, ambush attacks, the category that covers situations like the old National Bank shooting and the Galway Drive incident, consistently represent the most lethal encounter type for law enforcement. These are attacks where the officer has no warning, no time to establish a tactical position, no opportunity to apply what training had prepared them for before the encounter is already in its most dangerous phase. The profile of the suspect in ambush attacks on law enforcement is not uniform, but certain features appear consistently in the documented cases. Prior criminal history, prior use of weapons in criminal activity, access to firearm types, particularly semi-automatic rifles, that provide a significant tactical advantage over an officer's standard-issue sidearm or even a patrol rifle that has not yet been retrieved from a trunk. A willingness to kill that has been demonstrated, in many cases, before the encounter with law enforcement. Terry Clark Hughes Jr. was convicted felon. He had a semi-automatic rifle and over 100 rounds. He opened fire before the task force could complete its approach. Connor Sturgeon had purchased his AR-15 legally and had staged a position that gave him a sight line on approaching officers while preventing them from seeing him. He opened fire the moment Wilt and Galloway stepped out of their car. In both cases, the officers' training, experience, and character were real and present. In both cases, they were not sufficient to prevent tragedy. What the families carry. Zach Wilt told reporters that his twin brother wanted a steak dinner. That is the most humanizing detail in the entire Nickolas Wilt case. A 26-year-old who had been in the hospital for 3.5 months, who had undergone brain surgery and spent a month on a ventilator and worked through rehabilitation that most people cannot fully imagine, and what he wanted, on the day he was cleared to go home, was a steak dinner. That is not a story about a hero in the abstract sense. It is a story about a 26-year-old man from LaGrange, Kentucky, who had spent 7 years as a volunteer firefighter because public service was what he understood life to be for, who had worked as a dispatcher, who had gone through the academy and graduated and been on the job for 4 shifts, who got shot in the head on his way up a staircase and spent the next months learning how to be in the world again. He got the steak dinner. He went home. His twin brother was there. Andrew I, 3 years old, waved at his father's casket as it passed. His mother kissed his forehead. Ashley I was 31 years old when her husband died. Joshua had come home from 2 National Guard deployments. He had built a life in Charlotte. He had been Employee of the Month in April. Thomas Weeks had 4 children in Moseville. Sam Poloche left 2. Alden Elliott left 1. These are not statistics. They are people, complete, specific, irreplaceable people, whose presence in their families was the organizing fact of daily life, and whose absence is now the organizing fact of daily life in a completely different way. The hardened criminal problem. There is a tension that runs through the cases in this episode that demands to be named directly, even though it is not easily resolved. Terry Clark Hughes Jr. had a criminal record that made him a federally prohibited person, someone who, by law, could not possess a firearm. He possessed multiple firearms. He had over 100 rounds of ammunition. He killed 4 officers and wounded 4 more before he was stopped. Connor Sturgeon had no prior criminal history that would have flagged him as dangerous. He purchased his rifle legally. He killed 5 bank employees and critically wounded a police officer before he was stopped. The legal mechanisms that exist to prevent violent deaths of officers, prohibitions on firearm possession by felons, background check requirements for firearm purchases, warrant systems designed to get dangerous people off the streets, are real and meaningful. They are also, in these cases and in too many cases like them, insufficient to prevent the outcome they are designed to prevent. Gaps in the firearm acquisition system allow prohibited persons to access weapons. Legal purchases become weapons in mass casualty events. Warrants are served on armed subject whose specific armament is unknown to the officers approaching. This is not a simple problem. It is a structural problem embedded in the intersection of law, policy, enforcement capacity, and a specific vulnerability that law enforcement officers carry every time they approach an unknown situation. It is a problem that every officer in every department in this country knows about in the most personal possible way. They know it not as an abstraction or policy debate, but as something they carry with them in the car every shift. The knowledge that the person on the other side of the next door might be Terry Clark Hughes Jr. What we owe the rookies. Nickolas Wilt was on his 4th shift. He was, by the standard measure of law enforcement experience, a rookie in the most literal sense, a person who had just started. He had been on the job for 11 days. He had not yet developed the accumulated field experience that builds operational judgment over years. And he ran up those stairs, not because experience told him to, because training told him to, and because something underneath the training, something Humphrey called character, which is as precise a word as any for what it describes, would not let him do anything else. Every person who has ever put on a badge and walked out on their first shift carries something like what Wilt carried, the training, and underneath the training, whatever they are made of, the 2 things that Humphrey said. What we owe to those people, to the rookies and to the veterans who were rookies once, is not unconditional deference or immunity from accountability. The badge does not make anyone perfect, and there are legitimate questions about policing in America that deserve honest engagement and will not be resolved by this episode. But what we owe them is this, the full weight of recognition that what they do is genuinely dangerous in a way that is not always visible from the outside. that a patrol shift on a quiet Monday morning in April can end at a bank staircase, that serving a routine warrant on a Tuesday afternoon can end on a residential driveway in East Charlotte, that the distance between an ordinary day and the worst day is measured not in years or in skill level, but in a dispatch call and a door. The people who need to be named. Before we close, names: Joshua Barrick, Deanna Eckert, Tommy Elliott, Juliana Farmer, James Tutt, the 5 people who went to work at Old National Bank on April 10, 2023, and did not come home. Officer Nickolas Wilt, Officer Corey Galloway, the 2 men who drove to East Main Street in a patrol car on a Monday morning and ran up the stairs. Officer Joshua I., Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas M. Weeks Jr., Investigator Samuel Poloche, Investigator William Alden Elliott, the 4 people who walked up a driveway on Galway Drive and were ambushed before they could complete the approach, who left behind a wife and 4 children, a wife and 2 children, a wife and 1 child, a wife named Ashley, and a 3-year-old named Andrew who waved at a casket. The officers who were wounded and survived: C.J. Galloway, Chris Tolley, Mike Giglio, Jack Blowers, Justin Campbell, and who carry what they survived inside them in ways that no after-action report fully captures. These names belong in this conversation, not as symbols, as people. Closing. What does it mean to face a hardened criminal as a rookie? It means you have had 4 shifts to learn what the job actually is when the job is not a scenario. It means you have trained for months and passed every test and been told you are ready. And then you are in a situation where ready is not the word that applies, because nothing in the training produced a preparation for this specific moment on these specific stays. It means your training officer is beside you. It means the protocol is clear. It means your body is doing things your body has never had to do before. And it means you have, underneath all of it, whatever you are made of. Whatever made you fill out the academy application in the first place. Whatever made you show up at the LaGrange Fire Department as a volunteer at 19 years old, or complete 2 National Guard deployments, or spend 14 years in adult corrections before joining a fugitive task force. The hardened criminal in these cases had years on the officers across from them. Years of criminal activity, years of operating outside the law, years that produce a specific kind of ruthlessness that shoots at people who came to Cyber Warren on a Monday afternoon. The rookies had 4 shifts. The veterans had 13 and 14 years. Neither was enough to prevent what happened. Both were everything those officers had. And everything those officers had was, in each case, the complete expression of the people they were. The final question I want to leave with you is this, and I want you to wrestle with it genuinely in the comments. When you hear the phrase protect and serve, does it fully register what that means in practice? Not the abstract version, the practice version. The version where a 26-year-old with 4 shifts of experience runs toward an AR-15 because the training said to him because he couldn't do anything else. The version where 4 veterans with decades of combined experience walk toward a door and never come back. Does the public carry an adequate understanding of what that phrase actually requires from the people who carry the badge? Tell me what you think. Share this with someone. Say the names: Joshua Barrick, Deanna Eckert, Tommy Elliott, Juliana Farmer, James Tutt, Joshua I., Thomas Weeks, Samuel Poloche, William Elliott, and Nickolas Wilt, who went home for a steak dinner and needed one.